I'm Gareth Mitchell, and this is the Somewhere on Earth podcast. And our expert commentator this week is Ghislaine Boddington. And the keener listeners amongst us, Ghislaine, may have noticed that things sound a little different this week. Maybe
yes,
a bit less
we
studio-y.
definitely, a different ambient because we're in a room, a fairly big room actually.
Quite a swish room as well. It has
very
to be said.
swish room.
Yes.
Yeah, very nice indeed.
Indeed. And in fact, the geeky point for the audiophiles among our audience, we are using the same mics that we have in the studio. We've just put them on stands, or Stevie has anyway, our sound engineer, and brought them to a different place for a conversation that is going to be, shall we say, wide-ranging and something that is relevant to all of us. If you eat food, which I think counts for most humanoid life forms, this will matter to you.
It does matter. And not just humans, actually. Animals and birds and everyone. But food, we won't exist without it much longer than a few days. So, yes, this is a very important show.
Exactly. And well done for not making this human-centric. This is indeed a planetary issue. It's about the biosphere, biodiversity as well. Good one. Thanks, Ghislaine. Shall we jump in?
Yes, let's go for it.
And coming up today, agriculture is changing because it has to. Populations are growing and the climate is changing. There are massive challenges, but there are some incredible new solutions emerging too. And that brings us to the White & Case international law firm here in the centre of London. Cleantech and greentech need funding. That usually involves investors, and that involves deal making, and that involves contract and legal expertise. Now, fear not, we're not going to spend half an hour delving into the small print. The lawyers do that, so most of the rest of us don't have to. But we are here to discuss some of the exciting innovations promising to get food from the farm to your tummy. Yes, that's right here on the Somewhere on Earth podcast. Right, so second, because we've met Ghislaine, let's meet Emmie Jones, who's a partner here at White & Case. Now, I'll be honest, Emmie, when producer Anya said, we're going to do a programme from a law firm, I thought, we're a tech programme. What are we doing in a legal firm? So for people who may be still wondering, what are we doing? Tech programme sitting here talking to a lawyer. Why would we do that?
Well, I'm not surprised that it might seem as though the tech ecosystem is a million miles away from a law firm in the centre of London. But actually, tech, and more particularly clean tech and infratech, is massively important to all of our clients. The net zero transition is impacting everybody, whether that's our corporate clients and particularly the energy companies who are having to decarbonise and are making massive investments into new technologies to help them reduce their emissions, or whether that's the capital providers, so that's private equity, venture capital, the private credit solutions, sovereign wealth funds. All of them are being asked to invest into these new technologies. And they're doing so partly because they've got their own ESG targets that they need to meet, but also because this is going to be an absolutely critical industry and development for the world. I mean, you mentioned that everyone needs to eat, but everyone needs to be part of the net zero transition.
You mentioned your clients there, though, which is interesting. I guess you can't, for legal reasons, name your clients unless you want to. But can you give me an idea of the kinds of people that you do work with? Like, is it the venture capital firm specifically, or would it be, if I'm some startup working on green tech, do I come to you as my legal representative to make sure that everything goes through okay with the deal, or is it all of these things? What kind of people do you deal with?
It's all of these things, really. I personally am in a really fortunate position with my background's in private equity, so I do a lot of work on the investment side, but I also act for founders and the companies in these incredibly new and exciting startups. So I get to hear about such interesting technologies and deals, and then I get to be part of the solution of putting together investment to fund them.
And I suppose if you think about any of the tech in our lives, none of it really came into our sphere. It never ended up on the market or something that we interacted with without lawyers at some point going through the small print, as you say, so many of the other people don't have to, in order for the deals to happen and for the tech to be there. So,
I mean, that's such a good point, and I'm glad that you're validating my existence here. It's
Totally,
always nice to hear. But yeah, that's exactly right. No technology, however innovative or amazing it is, will be able to impact people's lives unless it's scalable, which means having investment behind it, which, as you say, means doing deals and means lawyers.
All right, okay. Now, also here is Benz Kotzen. He's at the University of Greenwich, where he's a professor of landscape and nature-based solutions. And when we talk about landscape and nature-based solutions, then what are you researching over there at the University of Greenwich? And spoiler alert for everybody, this is more than looking things up in a textbook, isn't it? You do some pretty amazing stuff over there.
Yes, we have a base at the University of Greenwich, and the building has been designed, for example, to have a number of green roofs or gardens. And this is kind of gives us an impetus actually to work on these real solutions to solve real world problems. So, for example, we're talking about green roofs and this is one of the research areas that we look at, green roofs in terms of what we call adding to the ecosystem services that nature provides. We believe that technology is advancing so very, very quickly, but we mustn't forget actually that nature, which has existed for hundreds of millions of years, has provided our ancestors and even us until recently with many of the solutions that we need. So, for example, when we're talking about ecosystem services of roofs, one of the things that a roof will obviously do is going to insulate a building. But a roof can also enhance biodiversity values. It can hold water, so we don't want water going to the drains all at the same time, and therefore we have problems in the Thames, for example. We know what that is. And we can provide food, we can provide amenity on our roofs. So that's just one little aspect of the research that we're doing. And actually a very big part of that actually is in London, and many of our big cities are getting warmer, and we have something called the urban heat island effect. I'm sure you've all heard about that. People die because of the rising temperatures that we're getting, mainly old people or babies. And there's a huge cost to, obviously, families and cost to the NHS. And if you have these green solutions, for example, we can mitigate some of those.
Yeah, because the green roof, does it absorb heat or something, or does it help to, well, not obviously not dissipate, but it's dealing with that whole issue of moving away from a concrete landscape that just acts like a great big storage heater. You're moving away from that with green roofs,
exactly.
aren't you?
So, I mean, the remarkable thing is, and I think it's so clever, nature is so clever. So, for example, what nature is doing, if you take the leaf of a plant, if you compare it to concrete or tarmac or something like that, which is actually going to be absorbing the heat and then releasing it and then kind of creating this added heat into the atmosphere, what is happening with the plant? It's absorbing the light. It's basically visible light and ultra-red light, and it's absorbing that to grow. So it's the energy
so
that's taking. Yeah. It's marvelous, isn't it?
It's amazing,
it's magic.
Because it's photosynthesizing and it's soaking up carbon, giving off oxygen.
Exactly, and
That's
so
pretty good, aren't they?
And so
someone should invent them.
And so this is the kind of thing that we're advocating, and we're doing research. We have these 10 green roofs. We have lots and lots of visitors. So if anybody's interested, get in touch with me, and we have groups to come and visit, because it's an exemplar of actually what can happen.
What's there? It's a way of demonstrating it to people, capturing the public imagination. It's captured your imagination, hasn't it, Ghislaine Boddington? Because you know the University of Greenwich very well, and you know about these green roofs, don't you?
Yes, I'm also in the School of Design with Benz. I'm in the design side, Benz is in the architecture and landscape architecture side. But we cross over a lot, and I love these green roofs. It actually makes going there an absolute pleasure. And I have to say, Benz and his team have got the most incredible sets of things growing. And several of them we can go out on. We can actually, there's one which comes off our office area, which is just beautiful to be on.
The working
we've got
environment.
Picnic tables, we can sit and eat our lunch, we can have meetings there. So the working environment's improved too, definitely.
You have that aspect. Okay. Emmie, you work with clients in this kind of area. And is it like green roofs and other areas related maybe to thinking again about urban or indeed rural landscapes, and doing so around agriculture, farming, aquaponics? What an area that is. Tell me about some of the clients that are working in this space.
Well, we as a firm have traditionally done a lot of work in the oil and gas space, and obviously with the energy transition and the move to net zero by 2050, all of these firms are now really investing very heavily in infratech or cleantech technologies. And so we're just seeing what seems to me, someone who's in no way an expert in the science, but it just seems so fascinating. We're seeing the biggest green hydrogen initiative, the biggest blue hydrogen initiative, these unbelievable things. And at the same time, also in the UK, things that are very tangible for ordinary people, like battery storage units, so that new build housing estates don't need to be powered solely by the grid. They can have their own batteries and their own way, not only of generating renewable electricity, but also making lives easier and less expensive for the people who are living in those houses. So it's a real world impact.
Yeah, and like you say, it doesn't get much more real world than needing the lawyers to come in to sort the contracts out to get that happening, you know. So, Ghislaine?
I wanted to ask you to maybe explain to our listeners and to me as well, actually, a little bit more about this ESG, which I've been... Obviously, it's been scattered all over the place and coming up for many years, but you mentioned it earlier, and I wanted to ask you what exactly that means and how you apply it in your work, but also how it's applied to the companies, because obviously things are moving. Is it because of the ESG side? Maybe you could explain it to us.
Yeah, and what it stands for, yeah.
ESG, you're absolutely right, is an acronym that people have been using for a long time. So it's environmental and social and governance issues. And it covers a wide range of topics. It covers your supply chain, checking that there's no human trafficking or slavery within supply chains. It's making sure that companies are well governed and are going to be sustainable businesses for the future. And then it's also the environmental side of that, the environmental impact. And it used to be something that was a bit of a tick box exercise. So if we were doing diligence, people would just want to know, they'd ask a very bland question about whether the target company had complied with its ESG obligations, and that would be the end of it. But there is now real teeth behind some of these, and there's proper interest in it. And it is impacting deals. Bidders won't progress through an auction, for example, because they're not satisfied with the ESG position of a company. So it's something that everyone is having to take seriously, and I think they're having to take it seriously because people are more interested. They genuinely care more about this.
It's not like a legal scenario. It's not like companies have to do it.
ESG is a kind of umbrella term. It's very,
Right.
very wide. So some parts of it, yes, absolutely, companies have to
Okay,
comply
yeah.
with. So there are laws in place that require absolute compliance. And then part of it is more a little bit woollier. And that's probably areas where people are less clear about what they're asking, and also the answers can be fudged a little bit more. But it's a very wide umbrella term that covers all sorts of legal obligations.
Which creates a business case for much of the kind of clean tech and green tech that we're talking about today. For instance, vertical farms. And I wonder if I can bring that back to you, Benz. So tell me, I've heard a little bit. What do we mean by vertical farming?
Now, I think you all probably realize that most farming that we recognize is horizontal. It's not vertical. And it's basically geometric in form and shape, and you can imagine rows and rows of corn or rows and rows of spuds and stuff like that, and it takes a lot of space. Of course, we realize, especially during COVID and when we have food shortages and we have problems when we need to be looking at the kind of footprint or the ecological footprint or the fuel that's required or the carbon footprint of produce, bringing this food from far away has all these consequences and bad consequences for our planet. And so one of the things that we need to do is to try become much more efficient in the way that we grow food. And this is where vertical farming comes in. There are various types of vertical farming. Of course, most of it is going to be done indoors in some kind of, whether it's going to be in a greenhouse, whether it's going to be in a shipping container or whatever it is. Depends on the kind of the scale of the business.
But the point being that all the produce or the crops, whatever, they're stacked.
Yes, they're stacked. And of course, if you've got 1 square meter of how much can you grow in 1 square meter, let's say you can grow, 5 corn or 10 corn plants. and corn's not a very good example because corn grows tall. But let's just say if you've got lettuce, for example, you can get 20 lettuce in 1 square meter. If we start stacking them like shelves, then we can, depends on how you want to go, we can double it, triple it, go as high as we want. So it becomes much more efficient.
Yeah,
and
in terms of the harvesting as well. Sorry to interrupt, but
Yes.
and servicing it, getting the water to it, all the things
Yes.
that you need to grow crops.
Yes.
It's all happening in
Yes.
the same space, but
Yes,
kind of
and of course it's climate
stacked.
controlled. So you don't have issues, for example, of weather, for example, bad weather, because absolutely everything is controlled. And so the temperatures are controlled, the amount of nutrients that is coming into it is controlled, and so the product is healthy and good. Basically, it's hydroponic, so it's actually using water with nutrients, and those nutrients in the water are being recycled. It's also extremely water efficient, which I think is something, if we go back to the right at the beginning of the conversation, or actually the theme of this, we're talking about green, we're talking about food, but actually water is just as much of a problem, if not a bigger problem for us.
Right, so many benefits there. And I don't know if it's just me, Emmie, but I feel as though I was hearing all about this, like all the time, like vertical farming. It was on the front covers of magazines and so on 3 or 4 years ago. Not hearing so much about it now. Is it still a kind of active space for VCs to be investing in, for instance?
It's really interesting, actually, though a number of investors did get into vertical farming a few years ago. But there have been real problems trying to scale those farms and make them economically viable. And there have been a number of cases of farms going into insolvency or Chapter 11 in the US, which is the US insolvency equivalent. And people have struggled so far to make it work. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think that obviously, as Benz was describing them, they're massively energy intensive because you need to keep them at controlled and quite hot temperatures, and there's a lot of light involved. And I think with all of the geopolitical issues and challenges that people have been facing, the energy costs obviously went up. So I think that was an issue. I also think that investors have become quite nervous about this as a sector, maybe because there haven't been runaway successes that they've been able to point to. And also because funding it is actually quite difficult from an investment perspective. They're so capex intensive.
So you mean capital expenditure? You basically just have to spend a ton of cash just to build one of these things.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
To be able to have proof of concept, you've got to build a farm which costs, I don't know, $50 million or something. And so you're asking investors to put a lot of money at risk in circumstances where there's no proof that this will be able to work or be viable or scalable. And that has been a real challenge for people. And I think this is something that is true of the wider clean tech and infratech environment. A lot of these great ideas are really capital intensive, and so they do require huge amounts of funding up front. And that's not really the way that the venture capital model has traditionally worked. If you think about what we think of as tech and huge VC successes, they've all been things that are immediately scalable because it's just code on a computer, and you can, an open banking license, all of the new open banking world, you can have one person using your tech or 10,000 and it makes no difference to you. And so VCs were able to come in with a certain amount of funding. Obviously, as the companies grew, more funding was required, but everyone was coming into the equity and everyone's interests were aligned. Investors were putting money in, management teams were being given options or sweet equity to encourage them so that everyone was aligned towards an exit. But where you've got huge capital requirements and huge amounts of money need to come in that can only be financed by an investor, it's very difficult for everyone else's equity to not to be hugely diluted, which means when you come to an exit, people don't really feel incentivized in the same way.
Okay, so that's cause for concern, obviously, Benz. Is this how you see it? Because you research this stuff, you actually have some vertical farming trials, effectively, part of your green roofs at the University of Greenwich. Are you saying, the way you see it, is that the case is made in terms of the agriculture and the way it all works, but it's just the funding aspect and maybe the legal aspects around it are holding it back? Or are there more fundamental reasons why we're not seeing this huge growth in vertical farms around the world?
One of the things is that all vertical farms are not the same. I think we need to say, for example, I had a bad example right at the beginning of growing corn in a vertical farm. You're not going to grow anything that is really quite large in a vertical farm. Most of the product is going to be something like herbs or green-leaved vegetables or cut and come again things like chards and things like that, which are rather kind of low. Again, also vertical farms can be these stacked shelves kind of things, but they can also be more like living walls, which I'm sure you probably all know about. And so they kind of plants stuck into kind of maybe troughs or something like that. And then you could be growing kind of bigger plants. So I think the kinds of plants that are in a vertical farm are kind of limited. Another one we can think of is mushrooms. We can grow mushrooms vertically, and I think this has been done for a very long time already. So growing them kind of in the shelf kind of unit. I think things that do work, I think there's a problem at the moment with them, I think economically, is, we're talking about hydroponics. And, most of for example, tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers we get are grown hydroponically. They're not in vertical farms. They're still in row kind of, but very, very automated and very high-tech kind of systems. And they've been sorted out over, let's say, the last 20, 30, maybe even 40 years in Holland. And now we have them in Kent, and I think they are profitable.
Yeah. And only just a really quick one. It
Yes.
just occurs to me, given that you've said, the great thing about this is it's all indoors as well. You've got a lot of control over the climate and the humidity and everything that the crops need. But the downside is that no biodiversity from outside gets to take advantage of that, presumably. You don't get pollinators going in there and other things. So there's a cost there, isn't there? Just briefly.
Yes. You have to bring the pollinators in.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So if you've got anything that needs pollinating, for example, obviously with green leaf vegetables, you don't need pollinators.
Yeah.
But with things like peppers and tomatoes, you need pollinators. So they bring bees in.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Some people might say, shipping bees in, or it's such a shame to have to do that. But anyway, you've mentioned many of the upsides as well. Ghislaine, just a little comment from you as we go on. We're going to change topic shortly, but just on this.
I think the vertical farming area is fascinating because it's always been in our kind of future view, hasn't it? It's like this will shift things. This will enable far more people to eat fast, like you say, ready to cut or grow again ones, etc. And there's two things about it that I think are really special in terms of future and tech stuff. One is the fact that the data gathered from them is so brilliant. You have this big data gathering, which actually can be reused and actually reused year on year in that vertical farming scenario, but also shared with others. So that actually the knowledge that we're getting, how to get the best produce out of it, the biggest productivity, the most efficient use is, like actually in some farming cover we've done for agritech, etc., is very much becoming a kind of collective shared environment where people can improve. And the second thing is, for a while it's been talked about, and I know there are quite a few examples now worldwide where, here we are in the middle of, the finance district in the city, and this area is actually pretty well filled up because there's a lot of banks, a lot of places. But we know in other areas in cities there are quite a lot of tower blocks that are not being used, and some of them are older, etc. And I know that in certain places they've started to layer these vertical farms into tower blocks where there's 30, 40 floors. And this is, one, it's saving land, two, it's actually creating farms directly within city environments, which then actually can feed directly into the restaurants, into the cafes, into our sandwiches at lunchtime, again, saving transportation, etc. So it's a very circular thing, isn't it? The whole circular economy within vertical farming is really fascinating.
I mean, it's also interesting that we know that plants require carbon dioxide to grow properly. And if you've got a building full of people, I mean, say half the building is empty, if we can direct that carbon dioxide that people are creating into those spaces, basically we're getting kind of free kind of carbon dioxide to make the plants grow. Also, many of our buildings are hot, and there's kind of excess heat, and we can use that excess heat. And also the kind of energy, there's kind of excess energy as well. So, if we have this kind of integrated thinking, then obviously I think the commercial side of it actually starts making more sense.
And just being very simplistic about it, just saying we don't need to have the green stuff out in the countryside and then the concretey and steely and glass stuff in the centre of cities. You know, we can bring these things together in
all
many
the
good
heat
ways.
from data. I mean, all the server heat in all these different buildings
That's
around
a
here
huge issue.
that can be fed into for vertical farming within tower blocks and things. Yeah.
Just before we leave it then, the maybe less clean aspects of clean tech. And this comes to mind because not so long ago here on Somewhere on Earth, we looked at some of the unclean aspects of clean tech. For instance, some of the rare earth materials that are going into the likes of batteries, for instance, and other kind of supposedly clean technology. These materials being mined in illegal mining operations in Myanmar, overseen by the military junta, terrible human rights abuses, awful working conditions. So a thorny issue to finish off with you, Emmie Jones, if you don't mind. And I know you're not a human rights lawyer, but nonetheless, that must be something that's on your radar here in a law firm when you're talking to clients who may be operating or could end up, if they're not careful, operating in areas where bad things are happening. So I'm just asking you really about the unclean aspects of clean tech here.
Certainly, people need to be looking holistically at the entire project that they're investing in, whether it overall does produce decarbonisation or whether it just shifts some of the, for example, air miles into a different area. And therefore, there's just leakage of carbon rather than actually cleaning it up. I mean, just as an example, when we're talking about vertical farming, I was reading the founder of one vertical farm say that because of the energy costs, it was very difficult to run it profitably in EMEA, but they were looking at the Middle East. And whilst you can, of course, understand that that means that the light and the heat will be much easier to source, if what you're then doing is flying your lettuce back into the UK, that's probably not really a green project that will ultimately help us all out.
Yeah, it's such an important point as well, isn't it, Benz? You know, and you're talking about so many, not just kind of vertical farming, but many of these other green techs. The question is, do the crops and the produce end up reasonably close to the markets they need to serve? And if not, it's defeating the object, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I think a lot of the research that we do, and it really needs to be kind of context-based. So, you know, we're talking about vertical farms, or we're talking about hydroponics, and also one of the things that we get involved with is aquaponics. So, for example, and we've been looking at aquaponics, which is basically a system where it's kind of hydroponics with animals. So we have fish that are producing kind of nutrients by feeding the fish. The nutrients are made available to the plants. The plants clean the water, they absorb the nutrients, etc. And we've been looking at this. Of course, there's various aspects of this. You know, can it be commercially viable, aquaponics? And it's kind of you know, it's debatable on a big scale, although it works in the United States. But for example, we're looking at aquaponic systems for the developing world. And those systems have to be very, very different, and the context is very, very different. You know, in the dry lands of Africa where they don't have enough water, if we can collect their water, and you know, people are living on very small plots of land, for example, and waiting for the rains, and they grow a few crops which they can sell at the market and send their kids to school, etc. You know, if we can have a system which is kind of working all the time and is not based on kind of waiting for the rainfall, etc., that can work, you know, in that kind of context. So I think not every context is kind of, you know, here in our environments. And also, for example, if we can have, you know, we have lots of meantime spaces in cities, places which are demolished or waiting for development, or rooftops. If we can have those kind of rooftop aquaponics or those kind of systems growing food for the local restaurants, etc., those small businesses can become viable.
Okay. Final few words from you, Ghislaine Boddington. What have you learnt today or observed?
I think it's fascinating. I think we, you know, as we started the show on this whole thing that food and water, as Ben's mentioned, is so necessary for all of us, for every living thing on Earth, and we know it is one of the areas that we've got to keep trying to stabilise, and it isn't stabilised. For many, many people, it's not. There's many people who go without food every day. And the food scarcity side and the food wastage side, which are two sides of the same problem, is so worrying, I think, worldwide. It's really good to talk out some of these solutions. to see what the circular economies can do with it, but also to know, actually, very positively, that that's been looked at really seriously by big corporates, by bigger companies, by big investors, who are, you mentioned, on a personal level, are taking an interest in this because they know these issues, wastage, shortage, etc., are not just for today, they are for our descendants, and we have to look at this carefully now.
All right. Well, there we'll leave it. Thank you very much indeed to you, Ghislaine Boddington, and also you, Emmie Jones, here at White and Case, and also you, Benz Kotzen of the University of Greenwich. Stevie Arnoldi has been our audio engineer today, and the producer is Anya Victorovich. The production manager is Liz Toohey. I'm Gareth Mitchell, and a very big and heartfelt thank you to everybody here at the White and Case International Law Firm in the centre of London for accommodating us today. We'll see you next time, folks. Take care. Bye-bye.